Elegant architecture, splendid Regency terraces, fine floral parks and tree-lined thoroughfares. This is the Cheltenham that attracts visitors who come from all over the world in their hundreds of thousands each year to experience its resort atmosphere. A stroll round the grand estates of Lansdowne, Pittville, Bays Hill or Montpellier could easily lead the visitor to believe that the town dates from the 19th century. But in fact, Cheltenham is much older, and its origins are far more humble than its appearance suggests. The earliest record refers to a Saxon religious house that stood in the 8th century at the Cambrai end of the High Street. The Domesday Book presents a brief sketch of 11th century Cheltenham and its immediate surroundings as having 5 mills and prospering agriculture. At least 900 years ago, there was a church occupying the site where St Mary's now stands. And only slightly more recently, a manor house which stood on land today occupied by St Matthew's in Clarence Street. The names of 4 tenants of the manor, which appear in a survey of 1334, are recalled in present-day place names. Richard Monk is remembered in Monkscroft. William Fiddler in Fiddler's Green. William Herter gave us Hester's Way. And land once farmed by Matilda Bays came to be known as Bays Hill. Cheltenham was an agricultural community, never a centre of the wool industry like its Cotswold neighbours of Northleach and Chipping Campden. Before it was enclosed into fields, farmers cultivated the land in long swathes, and evidence of the old strip system can be seen around the town to this day. Take a look at the lower slopes of Leckhampton Hill, for example, and you'll see the ridges and furrows quite clearly, especially in spring and autumn when the low sun teases long shadows from the ancient undulations. In 1226, King Henry III granted Cheltenham the right to hold a market every Thursday. 800 years on, the town still hosts a market on that day each week. John Leland travelled England and Wales in the mid-16th century, recording what he saw along the way. At Cheltenham, he found a long town having a market. He also noted, there's a brook on the south side of the town. The brook was, of course, what we call the River Chelt, but the river took its name from the town, rather than the other way round. The name Cheltenham is Saxon in origin and means the village near a cliff. On some old maps, the town's title is given as Cheltenham Street, for that's pretty well all there was of the place before the end of the 18th century. Until then, Cheltenham comprised a single thoroughfare, following the course of the present High Street, with a lane or two leading off. There was St Mary's Church, as we've already established. The Boys' Grammar School, built in 1578, which stood in the lower High Street between Bennington Street and Henrietta Street. Public business was conducted in the Booth Hall, standing on its stone pillars not far from the High Cross, roughly where the High Street now meets the promenade. There was a prison, and opposite the junction with what is now Rodney Road stood an almshouse, described as stone with a chapel attached to it, a courtyard with grass in front, and a garden, pasture and orchard at the back. The Plough, sited where the Regent Arcade now meets the High Street, was one of a few inns, which, with courthouse, parsonage and sundry cottages, comprised the town. One street continued with buildings on each side for a full mile. To the north, between what is now Pittville and Swindon Road, was an area known as the Marsh. The headmaster of the Boys' Grammar School had the right to keep a cow on this common land, but more gruesomely, it was here that the town's gallows stood, and was sometimes employed. Paintings of the town at this time appear to show a river running down the High Street, crossed by means of stepping stones, or a wooden bridge that stood at about the spot where the famous Gents Outfitters is today. In fact, a river didn't follow this course, but from the mid-16th century, the owner of Cambrai Mill was required by local law to direct water from his mill pond to flood into the street for the purposes of cleaning. In a similar early attempt to improve public hygiene, it was forbidden to wash clothes within 12 feet of the water pump that was used by residents in the lower part of the town. as it was to dump animal skins and carcasses into the river. Sir Robert Akins recorded in 1712 that Cheltenham boasted 321 houses and had about 1,500 inhabitants. This total was bolstered by Charlton Kings with 102 houses and 550 inhabitants, plus Leckhampton with 30 houses and 120 inhabitants. And that picture of a small, prospering rural market town might well have remained essentially unchanged well into the 20th century, had it not been for Captain Henry Skillicorn. One of the longest narrative plaques in the country can be seen in St Mary's Church. It commemorates Henry Skillicorn, a Manx seaman, who began the development of Cheltenham into a fashionable spa. Skillicorn inherited land around Cheltenham via his wife, who came from the town. The inheritance included a field at Bays Hill, where Cheltenham Ladies' College stands today, in which a mineral spring had been discovered early in the 18th century. According to local law, pigeons pecking at salt deposits around the spring first alerted people to the possible beneficial qualities of the saline stream, which incidentally is why the pigeon is a symbol of the town to this day. Towards the top of quiet Crippet's Lane at Leckhampton stands a pair of ornamental iron gates. How they came to this remote spot is a mystery, but in about 1830 they stood at an entrance to Cheltenham's original or royal spa. Perched on each gatepost is a pigeon, and the bird also features on modern signposts found about the town. The fashion for drinking spa water was gaining momentum in places such as Bath, Clifton and Tunbridge Wells. So the shrewd sea captain set about exploiting the business opportunity that was bubbling to the surface on his land. First, Skillicorn dug out the spring to make a well, then installed pumping apparatus. Over this was placed a canopied structure resting on 4 brick pillars. A small assembly room was built with a billiard room over it. The area was landscaped and an avenue with a double row of trees planted to form an impressive approach. Then, in the words of Skillicorn's diary, in the winter of 1739 I made the upper walk, planted elms and lime to the number of 37, and made a new orchard adjoining. The winter of 1740 I made the lower walk, planting 96 elms at the expense of £56. Had that summer 414 subscribers at the wells at 12 pence per piece. Built a yard round it and 18 little houses. The summer of 1740 was very dry. Had 674 subscribers at the wells. Business was plainly going well enough. But Skillicorn's venture received a boost when Dr. Short published his History of Mineral Waters and declared Cheltenham's spa superior to any in the country. Now things really began to take off. Short's praise prompted demand, and the former sea captain's fortunes rode the crest of a wave as the reputation of his saline spa was carried to London and beyond in bottles. Visitors of great fortune and gentility arrived to sip, and a programme of entertainments was arranged for the well-to-do incomers. Balls and playing card assemblies took place, along with theatrical presentations staged at the theatre, converted from a former malt house, where a young actress named Sarah Siddons was discovered. Residents of the town, it seems, were bemused by the arrival of worthies from London and such distant parts, and continued to stage entertainments of a more rustic kind, such as cudgel matches, bull baiting and cockfighting, all of which took place in the High Street. Cheltenham's popularity was gathering momentum, but the process received a meteoric thrust with the arrival in July 1788 of King George III, Queen Charlotte, 3 royal princesses, their aides, ladies-in-waiting, accompanying courtiers, and full entourage. The previous month, the king had suffered what he described as a pretty smart bilious attack, and had been advised by his doctors that the health-giving qualities of Cheltenham waters would have the sickly sovereign fit and perky again in 2 shakes of an Alban sceptre. In fact, the unfortunate monarch was suffering the early stages of porphyria, a rare genetic disorder that left him deaf, blind and mad for the rest of his life. But at least for the 5 weeks he was in Cheltenham, George seems to have enjoyed himself, quaffing at the well, strolling along the walks, riding out into the countryside without a bodyguard, quite safely as nobody recognised him, and going to the theatre. By the time their Royal Highnesses packed their bags to take the regal route back to London, Cheltenham was the most fashionable destination of the age. So much so that the list of notables arriving in town included 4 dukes, 3 duchesses, 6 marquises, 5 marchionesses, 4 bishops, 10 earls, 8 countesses, 53 lords, 70 ladies, besides a host of honourables, barons, foreigners of title and other persons of distinction. The latter group included, by the way, Frederick Handel, Jane Austen, and Fanny Burney, followed by Paganini, Liszt, Charles Dickens, and Oscar Wilde. Not surprisingly, other spas were opened by entrepreneurs. The oldest remaining example is found in Victoria Walk and was founded by a London banker named Henry Thompson in 1804. Thompson bought land on which the Montpellier and Lansdowne estates were developed, and by 1809 had opened the Montpellier Spa, originally a wooden structure, later replaced by the grand porticoed stone building that today is home to Lloyd's Bank. The copper rotunda, 160 feet in diameter and 60 feet high, was a masterstroke added by the London architect and gloriously named John Buonarroti Papworth. A curiosity in the shadow of Montpellier's Rotunda building is this fanciful statue of Edward VII, dressed in +4s and Norfolk jacket, comforting an unknown waif. Cheltenham doesn't boast many statues, but not far away in Montpellier Gardens is this figure of William IV, captured in full garter robes, which originally stood in Imperial Gardens. On ground now occupied by the Queen's Hotel stood the Imperial or Sherborne Spa, designed by the Jarrad brothers, who took as their model the Temple of Jupiter in Rome. The spa was connected to the town by the Imperial or Sherborne Promenade. Why the 2 names were used isn't certain, but the significance of the venture is because it established the route that became Cheltenham's Promenade, once eulogized by the Times as the most beautiful thoroughfare in Britain. The town has not, however, always been described in such glowing terms. Jane Austen spent 3 weeks here in May 1816 and returned later the same year with her sister to take the waters again. Apart from thinking her lodgings in the High Street outrageously expensive at 3 guineas a week, the visits seem to have left little impression on the novelist. In 1821, William Cobbett, celebrated author of Rural Rides, wrote, "Cheltenham is a resort of the lame and lazy, the gormandizing and guzzling, the bilious and the nervous, a nasty, ill-looking place, half clown and half cockney." Josephine Butler, the pioneer of women's rights, was appalled to find that in the Cheltenham of 1902 there are low-class brothels and slums which would be a disgrace to London and New York. And in his first novel, Decline and Fall, Evelyn Waugh took a sideways swipe at the town when he wrote, "If you make a prison bad enough, people will take jolly good care to keep out of it," a policy which soon became quite famous in the society of Cheltenham Spa. But back to the Queen's Hotel, which was built in 1837, opening a year later at a cost of £47,000. It occupied the site of the Imperial Spa, which was moved, stone by stone, lower down the promenade, to be reconstructed on the spot presently filled by Roy Scott House. Despite its magnificent appointments and opulent accommodation, the 70-bedroom hotel was by no means an immediate success, and was sold in 1852 for a fifth of its original cost. Over the years, the Queen's has been a temporary home to a glittering array of notables and celebrities, including Prince Louis Jerome Napoleon, the Rajah of Sarawak, and the Prince of Wales, later Edward VII. It was on an official visit in May 1897 that the Prince and Princess of Wales attended a banquet in their honour at Pittville Pump Room, where the courtly party embarked upon a luncheon of imperial proportions. Melon Gonzalez, œufs en coquette à la soubise, fillet de sole anglaise, noisette de mouton à l'épicurien, poulard de Surrey, salade, jambon de York froid, délices de fraises glacées, friandises, pêche, and coffee. And 5 wines, an 1824 champagne, and liqueur. But it was the biscuits, made by George's, a local baker, that really tickled the regal palate, as was reported in the Daily Telegraph on the day following. The Princess of Wales was much pleased with a dainty kind of biscuit, flavoured with vanilla, and honoured the maker with a request for the recipe. This royal approbation did wonders for the baker's business, and George's suddenly found itself the fashionable doyen of aristocratic nibblers. Typical was a note from the Duke of Manchester that read, "Messrs. George Limited are requested to send as soon as possible 2 dozen tins of the biscuits approved by Her Royal Highness the Princess of Wales." Outside the Queen's Hotel is an ornate plinth that many visitors to the town must find bemusing. In summer months, it's decorated with flowers galore, which, according to the words on the base, were taken at Sebastopol. In fact, the grey Victorian plinth is the survivor of a pair that were erected to display 2 cannon captured during the Crimean War. The Russian muzzle loaders were given to Cheltenham in recognition of its fundraising activities during the conflict by Lord Panmure, the Minister of War. The cannon were eventually mounted on their splendid, much argued about plinths on the 5th of July 1858, and the wrought iron arches of laurel leaves were added the following year. Both big guns, with miles of iron railings that once surrounded the town's parks and gardens, were removed, supposedly to be recycled as armaments. In the last quarter of the 18th century and first quarter of the 19th, various spas, some small, some short-lived, opened and closed. One of the more unusual was Cambray Spa, an attractive, octagonal Gothic folly designed by the Gloucester architect Thomas Fulljames. It stood in what is now Rodney Road car park from 1834, and the original proprietor was Bainham Jones. Chalybeate, or iron-rich mineral springs, had been discovered nearby in 1804, and, according to a contemporary guide, "We cannot give a stronger proof of their efficacy than by noticing the rapid restoration of Sir Francis Burdett, Bart., who came to Cheltenham in May 1805, very seriously ill and deprived of the use of his limbs. The worthy baronet was restored in a few days, and, by persevering in drinking the waters and bathing the parts affected, left Cheltenham in the month of September in perfect health." When the fashion for taking the waters dried up, Cambray Spa became a Turkish baths, and remained so for the half-century prior to its unfortunate demolition in 1938. Gloucestershire and England cricketer Gilbert Laird Jessup was born in this house at Cambray Place in 1874. He was a pupil of the grammar school and succeeded W.G. Grace as captain of the county side. A formidably fast bowler and agile fielder, Croucher Jessup, as he was nicknamed, due to his unorthodox stance at the wicket, was reckoned to be the hardest hitter of his age. By far the grandest of Cheltenham's spas was Pittville, and in financial terms it was also the greatest flop of the lot. Joseph Pitt was a man of vision, ambition, and terrible timing. He acquired 100 acres to the north of the town in the early 19th century and judged that 1820, when demand for property in Cheltenham was at a peak, was the right moment to start constructing his dream. And what a dream! Pittville was not simply to be an extension of Cheltenham, it was to be a new town. At its heart was a pump room to surpass all others, from which gracious villas would line the broad avenue, sweeping down to the aesthetically satisfying conclusion of an artificial lake. Space was reserved for a grand crescent and a church with tree-lined walks, rides and 600 houses in an assortment of architectural styles. The architect of this planned grandeur was John Forbes, who set the tone of things to come by being arrested for forgery. Found guilty of trying to pass off a false bill of exchange to his local butcher, Forbes was sentenced to transportation for life. This was commuted to 2 years in Gloucester jail, after which the talented Mr. Forbes was never heard of again. He was talented too, immensely so, because the pump room he designed is Cheltenham's finest Regency building. Here's a description of the town's architectural gem from John Goading's History of Cheltenham, published in 1863. The Spa has been pronounced the most beautiful and extensive establishment of its kind in Europe. Its first construction and the laying out of its drives, 6 miles in extent, cost £500,000 sterling. The building occupied 5 years in its erection and opened on the 20th of July 1830 by a public breakfast attended by the leading families of the county. The body of the building, which is 90 feet in length and 43 feet in breadth, is surrounded by a colonnade 20 feet wide, the roof supported by fluted columns 22 feet in length and with capitals highly ornamented. In the middle of the roof, a figure of Hygeia is placed, and the 2 wings ornamented with those of Aesculapius and Hippocrates. In the centre of the building is an elegant dome, raised to the height of 70 feet. Work started on the pump room in 1825, and the building was intended as the visual and social focus of the Pittville development. Forbes is said to have taken as his inspiration for the building the Temple of Ilissus in Athens. Just off the ground floor ballroom is the pump where spa water can be sipped to this day. A reading room, library and billiard room occupied the first floor. Space is now given over to the Museum of Costume and Fashion. Stand on the first floor balcony, look down upon the grandeur of the perfectly proportioned, lavishly appointed room, and it's easy to imagine throngs of fashionable and wealthy socialites, the glitterati of the 19th century, milling in the magnificent setting. The trouble was they didn't, or at least not enough of them to make the place pay. By the time Pittville Pump Room opened, spas were passé. The rich and influential stayed away in their droves, and Joseph Pitt's dream turned into a nightmare of unpayable debts. The County of Gloucester Bank grabbed Pitt's elegant but monumental white elephant of a building and sold it to Cheltenham Borough Council in 1889. Nobody knew what to do with the place. It provided the venue for the occasional flower show. A badminton club pinged shuttlecocks back and forth in the ballroom, and no maintenance was carried out on the fabric of the building. In World War II, the American forces of supply arrived on the scene. Nissen huts appeared in the grounds, jeeps appeared in the car park, and one of the finest Regency buildings in the provinces became a repository for tins of beans, rolls of lavatory paper, Hershey bars, and such accoutrements felt by Uncle Sam to be essential for the invasion of mainland Europe. When the GIs moved out after the war, the pump room was in so decrepit a condition that it was touch and go whether the building would be razed to the ground or restored. Mercifully, sense prevailed, and in 1960 the building was reopened by the 7th Duke of Wellington, whose forebear, the 1st Duke, had watched the pump room being built. Even though bankruptcy prevented the full realization of Joseph Pitt's epic concept, Pittville is among the finest estates of its period to be found in the country. For proof, you need only glimpse Pittville Lawn, entered via its splendid gates, which date from 1830. The ornamental arch that spans Pittville Gates was made by the firm of William Leatheran at its Vulcan Ironworks, which stood on the site now occupied by Lansdowne Industrial Estate. Leatheran's fine craftsmanship was exported all over the world, and local examples of the company's work can be seen in the chancel screen and font covers at All Saints' Church, the gates to Isle Court, or the gates outside Leckhampton Parish Hall. Leatheran's closed in 1906, but the tradition established by the firm for high-quality metalworking was continued by H. H. Martin and Company, which took over the Vulcan works. Pittville Lawn was started in 1832, and building continued for 10 years. It's a pleasing blend of formal terraces and individual villas, because would-be residents with the wherewithal were invited to build homes in a style of their choice. So they chose Greek Revival, Gothic, Italianate, or whatever flight of architectural fancy they thought would impress the neighbours. Wellington Square and Clarence Square are features of the Pittville estate that retain the elegance and tranquility of a time gone by. Today, you can wander in the peaceful gardens and admire the surrounding houses. In a previous age, however, each resident had a key to the private park their homes looked onto, and members of the general public were not permitted entry. Ellerslie, in Pittville's Albert Road, was, in the early years of the 20th century, home to the remarkable Rowena Cade. After the First World War, this doughty lady left for Cornwall, where she bought a plot of clifftop land near Land's End and spent the rest of her life building the Minnock Theatre, most of it with her own bare hands. The park area, a slightly later out-of-town development, was another grand plan that didn't quite work out as intended. Thomas Billings bought the 20-acre site in 1831, intending to open a zoo there, but the venture failed, and he sold the land to Samuel Whitfield Dawkes, the architect who designed Lansdowne Railway Station and St. Peter's Church in Tewkesbury Road. The Oval Park became pleasure gardens with a lake, walks and areas set aside for archery and cricket. Dawkes built the park's imposing villas and lived there himself in a Gothic fantasy of a house he designed called Tudor Lodge. In 1931, the failed zoo and former pleasure grounds became St. Mary's Teacher Training College, which in turn became the College of Higher Education. Some of the finest early Victorian villas and terraces are found in Bayshill Road, Parabola Road, and St. George's Road. The Skillicorn family sold the land in 1837 to the Bayshill Estate Company, whose directors were building speculators. Financial problems dogged the development, but over the next dozen years the fine local landmarks at Royal Well Terrace, Bayshill Terrace, now the George Hotel, and York Terrace appeared. So too did Royal Parade, and, standing guard at the top of Bayshill Road, Queen's Parade. Queen's Parade has the distinction of taking longer to be completed than any other building in Cheltenham. Started in 1839, work came to an abrupt end 7 years later when the builder went bankrupt. The Corinthian-style pavilion at the West End wasn't finally added until the mid-1980s. It was at number 3 Queen's Parade that Sir Arthur Bomber Travers Harris, GCB, OBE, AFC, LLD and Marshal of the RAF, was born in 1892. There are only about 90 of these Victorian letterboxes left in the country, and Cheltenham boasts 8 of them. They were designed by J.W. Penfold and first appeared in the 1860s. Just a stone's throw from here is another curiosity, the Gordon lamp. In 1885, residents in the area thought an ornamental lamp might brighten things up. Then, later that year, when General Gordon was killed at Khartoum, the residents decided their lamp would be erected in his memory. A public appeal for funds was made, and £20 trickled in. As the light cost £200, the organisers had to make up the difference. Then there was the question of who would bear the cost of illumination. The gas company quoted £22 per year, but the council said it couldn't pay more than £15 and suggested that only 2 of the 3 lamps should be lit. There were other problems too. The granite base was late arriving. The ironwork wasn't strong enough and had to be modified, and further expense was incurred when the lamp was converted to electricity in 1900. Due to all the wrangling, nobody remembered to add a plaque commemorating General Gordon until 1933. Montpellier was developed by Henry Thompson and his son Pearson. It was laid out early in the 19th century with attractive villas and terraces surrounding spacious ornamental gardens. In the 1830s and 40s, specialist shops were built to serve locals and visitors, and this quarter of town has retained precisely that character to the present day. Most picturesque is Montpellier Walk, where properties are separated by caryatids. There are 32 of these armless and doleful-looking ladies based on classical Athenian statues. 2 of their number date from 1840 and are made from terracotta, while the rest were copied locally last century. All except one made of concrete and added in 1970. They're not all the same, by the way. Some have their left leg forward, some have their right leg forward. A classical version of the Okey Cokey, captured in stone these past 160 years. Montpellier Arcade was built by the Jarrett brothers, who were local architects. The brothers also designed and built most of what we see today at Lansdowne, when the original developer, Pearson Thompson, found himself in financial difficulties. Thompson had commissioned the London architect J.B. Papworth to design Lansdowne Crescent, one of the few convex crescents in the country. But only numbers 1 and 2 had been completed when the Jarretts took over the project. They dismissed Papworth and his design, and completed the crescent in a simpler, less expensive fashion. Royal Crescent is Cheltenham's earliest string of Regency houses and was built between 1805 and 1825 to a design of the Bath architect Charles Harcourt. In 1830, number 18 Royal Crescent was home to the Duke of Gloucester, George III's nephew. He was visited by his cousin, the Duchess of Kent, and her daughter, Princess Victoria. It was the future Queen's one and only visit to Cheltenham. Lansdowne Place was started in 1825. The heart and honeysuckle design ironwork can be seen on balconies all over Cheltenham. Work commenced on nearby Lippier Terrace 20 years later, in the Italianate style. many buildings in Cheltenham are modelled on others elsewhere. This electricity substation near the town library was inspired by the 15th century Palazzo Strozzi in Florence. Joseph Hall, the borough engineer and architect of this unusual town landmark, which dates from 1894, also designed Cheltenham's first electric street lamps, known as Onion and Dragon standards. And the Neptune Fountain. Perhaps the most photographed feature of the promenade, this ornament is modelled on the Fontana di Trevi in Rome. It was unveiled on the 3rd of October 1893, commemorates nothing, and is in memory of nobody, but according to a town guide of 1950, it was installed when Victorian Gothicism was on the wane, with Beaux Art influences gaining ground on a lingering neo-medievalism. So there. Opposite the electricity substation, disguised as a Florentian palace in Clarence Street, is St Matthew's, built in 1879. Its brooch spire was removed in 1952, and the tower truncated 20 years later. But something of its former glory can be glimpsed in this 1920s film of the town, taken from St James Railway Station, which stood in St James Square until the 1960s. Cheltenham's new theatre and opera house, now called the Everyman Theatre, was designed by the architect Frank Matcham, who was also responsible for the London Palladium. Its curtain was raised in 1891, and first to tread the new boards at the opening ceremony was the celebrated actress Lily Langtry, who delivered this specially written verse. "Hail, Sylvan City, for thy vanished stage, with us returns at last a golden age. 'Tis strange that Thespis hence so long should roam. Where could he find a more congenial home than this fair valley sheltered from all ills in the broad bosom of eternal hills, where shrines of faith and learning greet the eye, nor fog nor factory smoke pollute the eye." Apart from referring to Cheltenham as a city, which it's never been, situated in a fair valley, which it isn't, Miss Langtry's grandiose doggerel does remind us of one accurate fact. Until well into the 20th century, Cheltenham had precious little industry, so not much in the way of fog nor factory smoke, and not much in the way of employment opportunities either, apart from domestic service. The High Street was Cheltenham in its original rustic form, but the town's second incarnation as a fashionable resort is represented by the promenade. As we've already heard, this celebrated thoroughfare was initially no more than an unmetalled ride joining the Imperial Spa with the rest of town. It was laid out in 1818 and lined with 44 chestnut trees. Then, land along its route was sold for development, and the first shop, the drapery business of Messrs. Clark and Debenham, soon to be known as Cavendish House, opened for business in 1823. In the same year, a fine house was built opposite, originally with a delicate ironwork porch, and a painter named Millet lived here. The house was converted into the Imperial Hotel, which in 1856 became the Imperial Club for resident noblemen and gentlemen. The post office acquired the building in 1874, and for the next 118 years, stamps were bought, parcels were sent, and postal orders were cashed here. In 1987, the post office moved out, and Hooper's department store moved in. Cheltenham's first post office, incidentally, opened in 1800 at 127 High Street, a part-thatched cottage with sheep in the garden. Letters were delivered by the elderly Sally Saunders, who sometimes kept them for 5 or 6 days after they'd arrived, because, she was reported to have said, she had better things to do than take one letter to the bottom of the street. Resident noblemen and gentlemen also puffed Havanas and passed the port at the New Club, which stood on the corner of Oriel Road, a site unhappily now occupied by the Quadrangle. Its neighbour, in stark architectural contrast, is the Town Hall. Designed by the Gloucester architect Frederick Waller, this was built in the first years of the 20th century to replace Cheltenham's previous main public venue, the Assembly Rooms, which stood in the High Street on the corner of Rodney Road, where Lloyd's Bank is found today. In an unsuccessful attempt to reverse the decline in popularity of Cheltenham as a health resort, the Central Spa was opened in the Town Hall in 1906. You can take the water there to this day, but you'll have to help yourself, No longer are there maids in mop caps and frilly pinnies to serve the salty solution, as there were when this 1920s film was made. At the same time, not far away in Bath Road, the Cheltenham Spa Medicinal Baths, in what is now the Playhouse Theatre, offered a range of treatments claimed to cure a medical encyclopedia's worth of ailments. To the rear of the town hall stood the Winter Gardens, Cheltenham's own Crystal Palace. Built in 1878, this magnificent declaration of Victorian engineering prowess fell into disrepair and was demolished in the early years of the Second World War. One of the corner tower bases remains, however, behind the open-air bar in Imperial Gardens. In 1825, a splendid terrace of private homes, Harwood's Buildings, was constructed in the promenade. The Borough Council acquired 5 during the Great War, and they've served as the municipal offices ever since. At one end of the long garden stands this statue of Cheltonian Edward Adrian Wilson, who accompanied Captain Scott on the ill-fated expedition to the South Pole, where he died in 1912. Wilson was a medical doctor, scientist, and accomplished watercolourist. Examples of his paintings can be seen in the town's art gallery, and very fine they are. Today, few of the fine individual villas, impressive terraces and sweeping crescents are private homes. Most have been converted to commercial use, a change of function that has helped to preserve the town's rich architectural heritage. It's a rare heritage too. Few towns or cities in the country rival the unity of architectural style found in Cheltenham, which, as we've seen, was largely built in a brief span of explosive development. There's far more to Cheltenham's past than meets the eye. But what does meet the eye, elegant buildings, splendid Regency terraces, fine floral parks and tree-lined thoroughfares, is a treasure of national importance.